A boy is standing in the rain, holding the body of his best friend. He has just been forced to choose between letting that friend die and letting the girl he has known since childhood die in his place. He did not have to choose in the end. The friend made the choice for him, smiling, walking himself onto the kunai placed in the boy's open hand. The boy's eyes have just opened in a way they have never opened before, and somewhere deep underground, something massive is beginning to wake up in answer to his grief. Nobody outside that small clearing in the rain country will ever fully understand what happened in the next few seconds. That is one afternoon in the early life of the Akatsuki, and the show kept writing afternoons exactly like it, quiet and devastating for the rest of its run. Tonight is a slow walk through the complete lore of the most feared organization in the shinobi world. Welcome to Anabrain. Let's get started. Section 1. The Rain Country and the Wars that Shaped It. Long before any cloak was ever stitched with red clouds, long before the word Akatsuki was spoken in fearful tones across the Great Five Nations, there was a country where the sky almost never cleared. Amegakure no Sato, the village hidden in the rain, sat in a small piece of land tucked between three of the largest powers on the continent. Its borders pressed against the land of earth on one side, the land of fire on another, and the land of wind not far beyond. Whatever weather rolled through the larger nations seemed to gather over the rain country and stay there. The air was thick with humidity. The streets were wet for so long that puddles became a permanent part of the architecture. Children grew up knowing the sound of water on metal roofs, the way other children, in safer places, knew the sound of birds at dawn. That metal was its own quiet feature of the country. Amegakure had no rolling forests, no warm farmlands, no open fields where a family could grow up under the sun. The capital was a tight, vertical city built from steel and pipework, full of narrow walkways and high towers that disappeared into the low clouds. The rain ran down those towers in long sheets and pooled at the bottom of every street. Smoke from old industry mixed with the fog. Lights were always on, since daylight could rarely make its way through. To live there was to live inside a constant gray, where the sky and the ground seemed to be slowly trading places, and where the only consistent sound was the small, patient rhythm of falling water against everything that stood upright. The rain country was not a wealthy place. It was not large enough to defend itself in the way the five great nations could. It had no famous bloodlines of its own. It produced no legendary clans the way Konoha or Kumo or EWA did. What it had instead was a position. Geography placed it directly in the path of every war the larger nations decided to fight against one another. When EWA wanted to press toward Konoha, the armies passed through the rain country. When Konoha wanted to test its strength against Suna, the battles often spilled across the rain country borders. When Kiri sent its shinobi south, the rain country sat in their way. The land itself became a kind of buffer, soaking up the violence that the Great Five could not, or did not bother to, contain within their own territories. The First Shinobi World War had already taught the small nations a quiet, terrible lesson. They were not partners in the conflicts of the giants. They were terrain. By the time the Second Shinobi World War arrived, that lesson had hardened into something bleaker. The fighting in this second war reached every corner of the rain country. Villages were burned. Crops were trampled by soldiers who never paused to apologize for the damage. Children who had been born in a brief stretch of peace woke up one morning to discover that war had come to their street and that no one was coming to push it back out. By the time the Second War ended, an entire generation of orphans had been left scattered across the alleys and ditches of the rain country, scavenging for food and shelter wherever the smallest piece of either could be found. Among that generation were three children who would later matter to this story more than any others. A boy named Yahiko, fierce-eyed and stubborn even in hunger, lost his parents in the chaos. A quiet girl named Konan, gentle in temperament but quick with her hands, was left without family in the same period. And a thin, red-haired boy named Nagato, who carried within him a bloodline he did not yet understand, watched his own parents die in their small home at the hands of two Konoha shinobi who had broken in during a moment of confusion and panic. The shinobi were not villains in any simple sense. They were soldiers in a war they had not started either. They saw movement in a kitchen, reacted, and only afterward realized that the people they had cut down were civilians. When the dust finally settled, a small child sat in the wreckage with no parents left to call to. He was very young. He did not yet know what his eyes would one day be capable of. He only knew that the world had taken everything from him in a single afternoon, and that the rain outside had not stopped to notice. Each of these three was very young. Each of them had no one. The rain country was full of children just like them. More than any orphanage could have absorbed, even in a peaceful season. Far more than any neighbor could have been asked to take into an already hungry household. There were no programs to gather them. There were no caretakers waiting at the edges of the conflict to receive them. They simply existed, in small clusters and lonely doorways, learning to fend for themselves before they had learned to read. The man who held authority over this country during these years was Hanzo of the Salamander. His reputation extended well beyond the rain. Hanzo had once fought all three of the legendary Sannin from Konoha at the same time and survived, which was a feat that almost no other shinobi in the world could honestly claim. The title of Sannin itself, which Konoha would later wear with quiet pride, was given to Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Orochimaru by Hanzo himself, in recognition of the simple fact that the three of them had managed not to die. He carried a poisoned blade. He had a chakra bond with a massive salamander summon that lived in caves beneath the country. His face was wrapped in a mask attached to a breathing apparatus, since the same poisons that protected him in battle had to be kept away from his own lungs. He ruled the rain country with a tight, suspicious grip. Outsiders called him a hero. Many of the orphans of his own country, when they were old enough to speak about him plainly, came to know him as something colder. Hanzo was not a cruel leader by simple nature, but he was a leader shaped by the same wars that had ruined his homeland. He had watched the Great Five trample his country over and over again, and he had concluded that survival required total control. Any group that gathered in the rain country without his approval was viewed as a possible threat. Any whisper of organized opposition was treated as the seed of a coup waiting to sprout. Quiet networks of informants moved through the streets at his direction. Foreign agreements were maintained whenever those agreements served him. His people remained alive, which was no small thing in such a battered land, but they remained alive on his terms, and his terms grew narrower as the years went on. By the time the next war arrived, his fear of being overthrown had begun to outweigh his interest in being loved by the country he protected. Then the Third Shinobi World War began. Once again, the Great Five clashed, and once again the Rain Country was the unfortunate middle ground. This was the war that would later become famous in the larger story of the world for the figures it shaped, the legendary teams it produced, and the decisive battles that scarred entire generations of shinobi. For the Rain Country itself, it was simply another long stretch of suffering. Soldiers marched through. Villages were ruined again. Hospitals filled with the wounded faster than they could be emptied. The orphan camps grew larger. The puddles in the alleys ran red on more days than anyone wanted to count. And the water carried that color toward the rivers and out of sight, where the Great Five could pretend not to see it. Somewhere in the middle of that war, the boy named Nagato was found wandering the wreckage with a small dog and a piece of bread that was barely enough for one of them. He was thin to the point of trembling. He had stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. He had nowhere to go. Some distance away, Yahiko, the slightly older of the three children this story will follow, had already paired up with the quiet girl named Konan, who carried herself with a softness even hunger could not quite take from her. The two of them shared whatever scraps could be stolen or salvaged, and they had built a small hideout pieced together from old wood and abandoned cloth. The three of them were not yet a unit. The story that would carry their names into the eventual history of the Akatsuki had not yet begun to be properly written. The conditions for that story, however, were being laid down with every shell that fell on a Megakure, with every parent who did not come home, and with every silent night spent under a leaking roof. There is something worth slowing down for before this section comes to its close. An organization like the Akatsuki could not have come from a peaceful country. It could not have come from a powerful country either. The five great nations had their own structures, their own pride, their own wealth, and their own villages full of trained shinobi who lived inside familiar systems. None of those places were producing children who looked at the world and concluded that the entire system needed to be torn down to its roots and rebuilt from scratch. The Rain Country was. The Rain Country, year after year, kept producing orphans whose first memories were of fire and screaming, and who grew up watching their own leader bend in whatever direction the winds of the Great Five chose to blow, and who slowly came to understand that no one outside their borders was ever going to step in and save them. That kind of childhood does something to a person. It either breaks them, or it hardens them into a shape the world has never quite seen before. The seed of the Akatsuki, then, was not a single decision made by a single person on a single day. It was a slow accumulation. It was the rain that fell every day in a country no one in power wanted to defend. It was the wars that came every generation and never seemed to end. It was the sight of small bodies in alleys after the soldiers had moved on, and the way no one had time to bury them properly. It was the silence of a leader who had survived too much and forgotten how to trust anyone. And it was the quiet promise made by a few hungry children in a hideout made of stolen wood and salvaged blankets that whatever world had given them this one, they would not pass that same world on to anyone who came after them. From that promise, slowly and tragically, an organization that would one day terrify 5 nations was beginning to take its earliest shape, even if none of the children involved could have named it yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Rain Country has been laid out now in its earliest, most painful form, with its constant gray skies, its powerful and watchful leader, and its long line of children who never quite learned what peace was supposed to feel like. 3 of those children, in particular, were beginning to drift toward one another through the wreckage, though none of them had yet spoken the words that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. In the next section, the path turns from the country itself toward those 3 small figures, into the moments that pulled them into the same hideout, the same hunger, and eventually, the same long shadow of training under one of the most famous shinobi the Rain Country had ever lost a fight against. From here, the lens narrows from the world onto 3 small names, and the story slowly becomes the personal story of Yahiko, Konan, and Nagato. Section 2. 3 War Orphans and the Sannin Who Found Them. The story now narrows from the country itself onto 3 small figures inside it. 3 children, each carrying a different shape of loss, each drifting through the same wet streets, each quietly waiting to find someone who might one day explain why the world had turned out this way. The first of them, in age and in temperament, was a boy named Yahiko. His exact birthday is not laid out in canon with much precision, only the simple truth that he was born sometime before the Second Shinobi World War and lost his parents during it. By the time he was old enough to remember faces clearly, his parents were already gone. He learned to scavenge before he learned to read in any serious way. He learned that hunger could be ignored for a while if a person had something to be angry about. And he discovered, even as a small child, that anger came easily in a country that kept getting walked over by armies that did not belong to it. He was sharp-eyed, quick on his feet, and stubborn in the way that the Rain Country often produced in its survivors. He did not cry when crying would not help. A few alleys away, a quiet girl named Konan moved through her own version of the same loss. She too was an orphan. She too had lost her family in the same long war that had taken Yahiko's. Where Yahiko was loud in his stubbornness, Konan was soft in hers. She was patient. She was watchful. She had a small, careful way of folding paper that she had picked up almost by accident, the kind of habit that lonely children sometimes develop just to keep their hands busy when nothing else made sense. The 2 of them eventually crossed paths, in the way that children with no families always seem to find one another in cities full of pain. They paired up. They shared scraps. They learned which alleys were safe and which were watched. They built a small hideout from old wood and abandoned cloth, in a spot that no one official seemed to care about. It was the closest thing either of them had felt to a home in years. And then, somewhere in the middle of the Third Shinobi World War, Konan brought home a 3rd stray, a thin, red-haired boy who had been wandering the rubble alone, with little more than a single piece of bread to his name and a small dog walking at his heels. The boy's name was Nagato. His story up to that point was its own quiet tragedy, much harder to carry than the others, even though they were all carrying something similar. Nagato had been born to a couple living quietly in the Rain Country, a couple who, in a piece of canon that the manga revealed only much later in the story, were descendants of the Uzumaki clan. The Uzumaki were a famous red-haired clan whose long lifespans and unusually deep chakra reserves had once been one of the world's quiet wonders, before the clan itself was hunted to scattering. Nagato's parents kept their heads low. They did not advertise their lineage. They lived in a small, ordinary house, and they tried to raise their son away from the wars that kept ruining their country. The wars came anyway. During one of the larger campaigns of the Third Shinobi World War, 2 Konoha shinobi entered the Rain Country on a mission. They were soldiers in a war that was not theirs to start. They were tired, and they were on edge, and they were operating in enemy territory where every shadow could potentially turn into an ambush. They came to Nagato's home expecting trouble. When they encountered Nagato's parents, the shinobi reacted as soldiers in foreign territory often did. They struck first. By the time they realized that the people they had cut down were civilians who had only been trying to protect their child, the damage could not be reversed. Nagato saw it happen. The exact details of what he saw and what he did not see are not laid out in the manga in great visual depth, only that he was young enough to be helpless and old enough to remember every moment of it for the rest of his life. Something else was true of Nagato that no one yet knew, including Nagato himself. As an infant, he had been quietly visited by an old man, who would later prove to be one of the most important figures in the entire larger story. That old man was Madara Uchiha, then nearing the end of his unnaturally long life, and he had implanted into the baby a pair of eyes that should not have existed in a child of that bloodline at that age. Those eyes were the Rinnegan, the legendary dojutsu of the Sage of the Six Paths. Madara had reasons of his own for placing those eyes into a small Uzumaki boy hidden away in the Rain Country. Those reasons would matter much later. For now, the eyes simply slept inside Nagato's small face, ringed in their distinctive purple pattern, waiting for a moment of grief or fear strong enough to wake them up. That moment had come, or was very close to coming, when Conan found him. Nagato was thin past the point of trembling. He had stopped speaking to anyone unless he absolutely had to. The only living thing that still followed him was a small dog he had named Chibi. The dog was malnourished too, but it had stayed near him through everything, the way dogs often will. Conan offered him food. She brought him back to the small hideout where Yahiko was waiting. Yahiko, in the way of older children who have built something of their own with hard work, was not initially pleased to see another mouth to feed. He pushed back. He questioned. He looked at this thin, quiet boy and asked what value he could possibly add to a household that already had to scramble for every meal. Then, Nagato spoke. He spoke about peace. He spoke in the small, careful sentences of a child who had seen too much, about a world where children would not have to go through what they had gone through. There was something in that voice, in the simplicity of it, and in the weight behind it, that reached past Yahiko's defenses. Yahiko softened. He accepted Nagato into the group, and the three of them, from that day forward, became the small unit that would eventually grow into something the entire shinobi world would have to reckon with. For a while, life inside the hideout was as gentle as their circumstances allowed. The three children stole what they needed and shared what they stole. Chibi the dog padded around at their feet. Yahiko cracked jokes when food was scarce, since laughter was sometimes the only thing in the cupboard. Conan worked her quiet origami in the corners. Nagato slowly began to speak more, slowly began to look up rather than down. They were still hungry. They were still in the middle of a war zone, but they had each other, and for orphans of that war, that was no small thing. Then, on one ordinary day, the war touched them again. There was a battle nearby, between Hanzo of the Salamander and three foreign shinobi from Konoha. The three Konoha shinobi were Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Orochimaru. Three young soldiers who would later be famous across the entire world, but were, in that moment, simply trying to survive an encounter with the strongest man in the Rain Country. The fight rolled across territory that intersected with the children's small life. In the chaos, Chibi was struck. The little dog who had walked at Nagato's heels through every hungry day died in the open street. The children buried Chibi together. Yahiko, in the calm, terrible logic of a child who has decided that things must change, declared that they were going to find those three Konoha shinobi and ask them to teach them. They had clearly been powerful, since Hanzo had not killed them outright. Yahiko reasoned that learning power was the only way to stop being the kind of children that wars happened to. They found the three Konoha shinobi resting at the edge of the Rain Country, between battles. Yahiko approached and asked, simply, for food. Jiraiya gave them food. Orochimaru, with the cold logic that would later drive so many of his choices, suggested that the merciful thing would be to kill the children quickly, since they had no future in such a country. Tsunade was uncomfortable with that suggestion. Jiraiya rejected it outright. Then Yahiko asked for something else, something larger. He asked the three of them to teach him and his friends to be ninja. Jiraiya hesitated. He was not in the Rain Country to take on students. He was a soldier in an active war. He told them no, at first. He left them food and intended to move on. Then a small encounter changed everything. An Iwa Chunin, somewhere in the same general area, came across Yahiko and Nagato during a moment when Jiraiya was not nearby. The Chunin attacked. Yahiko was knocked aside. Nagato, for the first time in his short life, felt fear and rage rise inside him at exactly the same moment, and the eyes that had been quietly sleeping in his face since he was an infant finally woke up. The pattern of the Rinnegan rose in his pupils. The Chunin died in a quiet, irreversible way that Nagato would not be able to forget. When Jiraiya returned and learned what had happened, his decision shifted. The Rinnegan was not a small thing. The Rinnegan was the eye of the Sage of the Six Paths himself, the legendary figure at the root of all ninjutsu. To find that eye in a hungry orphan in the Rain Country was something that demanded a response. Jiraiya stayed. He stayed for 3 years. He trained the three of them in the basics of being a shinobi. He taught them to draw chakra, to mold it, to use it carefully. He taught them simple techniques and corrected their forms patiently. He fed them, he sheltered them, and on the long, quiet evenings, he spoke to them about the world. He spoke about the cycle of hatred that he had begun to suspect might be the deepest curse on the shinobi world. He spoke about how a true child of prophecy might one day appear who could break that cycle. The 3 children listened. Nagato, in particular, listened with a stillness that bordered on reverence. The seed of an ideology was being planted in him during those evenings. An ideology about peace, about pain, about whether the world would ever change without being forced to. After 3 years, Jiraiya decided that the children could fend for themselves. He had a war of his own to return to. He said his goodbyes, with all the awkward warmth that Jiraiya tended to bring to such moments, and he left them in the Rain Country with the skills he had given them. The 3 of them watched him go. They were no longer the same small children who had buried a dog in an alley. They had names now. They had power now. And they had something more dangerous than either of those things. They had a shared belief that the world they had grown up in was not the world that should exist, and that perhaps, given enough time and enough effort, 3 of them could begin to bend it into something better. Word would later reach Jiraiya, through quiet channels, that his 3 students had been killed in some unknown skirmish. He grieved them in his own way, and then he moved on. He had no idea in those first years after leaving them that the 3 orphans he had once taught to mold chakra were quietly building an organization in the Rain Country, an organization that would one day grow into the most feared name in the entire shinobi world. The students he had mourned were very much alive. The promise they had made in their hideout, the small promise to give the next generation a different world, was already taking its first organized shape, even though none of the shinobi nations had yet noticed that anything was happening in the rain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 3 children of the Rain Country have now been gathered, taught, and quietly let loose into a world that did not yet know their names. They have buried their dog, met their teacher, lost him again, and inherited a single shared belief that the cycle of war must somehow be broken, even if no one has yet shown them how. In the next section, the lens widens just slightly. From the 3 of them to the small organization they were beginning to build around themselves. The early followers who began to gather under Yahiko's quiet leadership, and the masked stranger who appeared on their path one evening with an offer that no one in the group quite trusted. From that gathering, and from the trap that would eventually be set against it, the original Akatsuki begins to take its tragic and short-lived shape. Section 3. The First Akatsuki and the Trap of Hanzo. The years that followed Jiraiya's departure were, by the standards of the Rain Country, almost gentle. Yahiko, Konan, and Nagato had skills now. They could hunt down the small criminals who preyed on orphans like themselves. They could defend their hideout. They could feed each other reliably for the first time in their short lives. And as small ripples of safety began to spread out from their corner of the Rain Country, other children with similar stories began to drift toward them. Yahiko, in his blunt, practical way, never sat down and decided to start a movement. The movement gathered around him because he was visible, because he was loud, and because he refused to let anyone walk past suffering without doing something about it. Children fed in his small camp told other children. Older orphans, already half-formed shinobi from their own desperate self-training, came looking for somewhere to belong. Small farmers protected from bandits whispered his name to their neighbors. Gradually, a real group began to form, with real members, and real opinions, and real responsibilities. He gave the group a name. He called it Akatsuki, which in the language of the country meant dawn or daybreak. The choice of word was important. Yahiko did not want a name that suggested anger or revenge. He did not want to call themselves anything that sounded like an army. He wanted a name that sounded like a sunrise, like the moment when a long, dark night finally yields to the first quiet light. He chose Akatsuki because it represented a hope that the Rain Country, and eventually the wider shinobi world, might one day wake up into something better. The early members were not famous people. They were not S-rank criminals. They were not clan heirs or prodigies. They were ordinary shinobi from the Rain Country who had been grinding through the same life Yahiko and his friends had. Their names appear in the canon of the story only in passing, since the shape of the group would later change so completely that the early members were almost forgotten. There was Daibutsu, a heavy-set man with a quiet manner. There was Kie, a thoughtful presence at the edge of meetings. There was Kyusuke, and there were others whose names did not even survive into the recorded history of the world. They were a small crew. Most of them had lost family. Most of them had grown up watching foreign armies trample the Rain Country. All of them believed, in the simple way that traumatized people sometimes believe, that something different had to be possible. The original Akatsuki worked, at first, almost like a network of community defenders. They protected villages from bandits. They helped travelers move safely through dangerous parts of the country. They negotiated, when possible, between small groups who would otherwise have come to blows. Yahiko led with charisma rather than ideology. He was not a great philosopher. He was a leader who knew how to get tired people to keep going for one more day. Konan handled the careful work, the planning, the quiet diplomacy with people who needed gentleness more than force. And Nagato, with his strange ringed eyes carefully hidden whenever they could be hidden, served as their final line of defense, the quiet figure who only stepped forward when nothing else would solve the problem. Their reputation grew faster than they expected. Within a few years, the name Akatsuki had begun to travel beyond the Rain Country itself. Travelers spoke of a group of orphan ninja in the Rain Country who could be trusted, who would help small people for little or no payment, and who appeared to be slowly stitching the country back into something almost like a society. Foreign shinobi began to take notice. Foreign governments began to take notice. And Hanzo of the Salamander, the man who still ruled the Rain Country with his tightening grip, began to take notice as well. Hanzo's reaction was, in many ways, the most predictable thing in the entire story. A leader who had spent his entire life worrying about being overthrown saw a popular, organized, increasingly powerful group of young shinobi rising inside his own borders. And he reached the conclusion that any leader of his temperament would eventually reach. He decided that the Akatsuki, whatever their stated intentions, would have to be either controlled or destroyed before they grew large enough to challenge him directly. Around this same time, another figure entered the story. He came quietly, wearing a mask that hid his entire face except for one eye. He introduced himself at this first meeting as Madara Uchiha. He brought with him a strange, dark, half-organic companion called Zetsu, a creature with two halves of different colors that seemed almost to be a single plant given the rough shape of a man. The masked man approached the leadership of the Akatsuki and offered his help. He told Nagato that Nagato carried the eyes of the Sage of the Six Paths. He told him that he could teach him to use those eyes to their fullest potential. He hinted at a larger purpose for the world, a way to break the cycle of war for good. Yahiko, with his usual blunt honesty, did not trust him. He told Nagato to refuse. He warned the masked man to stay away from his people. The masked man left without resisting. He waited. The masked man, in fact, was not Madara Uchiha at all. He was a much younger figure who had taken on Madara's name as a kind of mask of his own, and he had his own much larger plan unfolding underneath the meeting. That plan would matter immensely later in the story. For now, he simply withdrew, content to watch the Rain Country from a distance, and wait for circumstances to shift in his favor. There is a small piece of canon worth flagging here. The masked man would later claim that it was his quiet encouragement that had inspired Yahiko to form the Akatsuki in the first place. Konan, who had been there from the beginning, told a different version. She gave that credit to Yahiko's own charisma, and to the long shared promise the three orphans had made before any masked stranger had ever stepped into their lives. The truth is most likely closer to Konan's account, since the masked man only met Yahiko once, and Yahiko openly distrusted him. Circumstances were already shifting. Hanzo's nervousness had not gone unnoticed by other powers. In Konoha, a man named Danzo Shimura, the head of the secretive ANBU unit known as Root, had been quietly watching the Rain Country for some time. Danzo was a careful, paranoid figure who believed that Konoha's long-term safety required pushing influence into other countries by any means necessary. He saw, in Hanzo's worry about the Akatsuki, an opportunity. He reached out to Hanzo. He offered, in subtle and unsubtle ways, to help. He fed Hanzo information that suggested the Akatsuki were even more dangerous than Hanzo had feared. He suggested that the most efficient solution would be a single, decisive strike that would remove the leadership of the group all at once. Hanzo, who had survived this long by being willing to act decisively when he saw an opening, agreed. The two men, working through quiet channels neither of them ever publicly admitted to, began to build a trap. The trap was set in the shape of a peace offering. Hanzo sent word, through his official channels, that he wished to meet with the leadership of the Akatsuki. He framed the meeting as a diplomatic gesture. He suggested that the Akatsuki, given their growing influence, might serve as a useful bridge between Konoha, Iwagakure, and Tsunagakure in delicate peace negotiations. He spoke of using their reputation to broker a real, lasting calm. To Yahiko, who had spent his entire short life trying to imagine a path toward peace that did not run through more bloodshed, the offer was almost overwhelming. He agreed to the meeting. He brought Konan with him. Nagato was nearby in support. They came to the appointed place expecting to be heard. What they found was an ambush. Hanzo's forces, working with Danzo's root operatives, surrounded them. Konan was seized. The trap was complete. Hanzo, with the cold practicality that had carried him this far, then offered Nagato a choice. He told Nagato that he would release Konan only if Nagato killed Yahiko with his own hands. The choice was framed as impossible on purpose. It was meant to break them all at once. It was meant to either destroy Nagato's will or create the kind of fracture that would make the Akatsuki incapable of recovering. Nagato hesitated. His hands shook around the kunai he had been forced to take. Yahiko looked at him steadily. Yahiko understood what Hanzo was doing. He understood that any choice Nagato made on his own would haunt him for the rest of his life. So Yahiko, who had always led from the front, made the choice for him. He stepped forward. He drove himself onto the kunai in Nagato's hand. He smiled at Nagato as he did it, the small, steady smile of someone who has decided that their job is done and that the next chapter belongs to someone else. He told Nagato, with his last breaths, that the dream of peace had to keep going. He reminded him of Jiraiya's words from years ago about a child of prophecy who would change the world, and he placed that hope onto Nagato's shoulders. He died smiling, in Nagato's arms, in the rain. Konan screamed against the hands holding her. Hanzo's forces moved to finish them all, and inside Nagato, the slow, careful structure of who he had been for the past several years finally collapsed under the weight of what had just happened. The Rinnegan in his eyes flared in a way they had never flared before. Something deep underground responded to that grief. The country itself seemed to tilt, as if a much larger creature than any person on that battlefield had just opened its eyes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first Akatsuki has now been built and broken in the same chapter, gathered around Yahiko's quiet charisma in a peaceful season, and shattered in a single ambush by the very leader who was supposed to protect the Rain Country. Yahiko has died smiling, with his dream entrusted to a friend who is no longer steady enough to carry it the way he carried it. Konan has been pulled back from captivity to a world that no longer holds the person who held them all together. In the next section, the story turns toward what Nagato did with that grief, the dark shape that rose from beneath the Rain Country in answer to his pain, and the slow, terrible transformation of a quiet boy into the figure that the world would eventually come to know only by the name of Pain. Section 4. The Birth of Pain and the Six Paths. The grief that opened inside Nagato in the moments after Yahiko's death was not something a young man could carry on his own. It was bigger than anything he had experienced before, even in the long, quiet years of being orphaned. It was the kind of grief that does not ask permission before it changes the shape of a person. And it found him at a moment when his eyes, those strange ringed eyes inherited from a sage older than any country in the world, were wide open and exposed. Hanzo's forces were closing in. Konan was still being held by his soldiers. The rain was falling in heavy sheets over the small clearing where the ambush had been sprung, washing the blood across the muddy ground and into the cracks between the stones. Yahiko's body lay against Nagato's chest, still warm. Nagato did not have the time to grieve in any normal sense. He did not have the time to fall apart slowly, the way most people fall apart after losing someone they love. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it in the next few seconds, before Hanzo's people finished what they had started. What rose inside him in that moment was not a plan. It was not a strategy. It was something closer to a scream that had nowhere to go. The Rinnegan in his face responded to that scream. The Eye of the Sage, the most powerful dojutsu the world had ever recorded, did not simply sit decoratively in a person's skull. It was a tool that could reach into the deeper machinery of the world. And in that machinery, somewhere underneath the Rain Country, somewhere that should not have been reachable by any normal shinobi, a creature had been quietly waiting for someone with the right eyes to call it. The creature was the demonic statue of the Outer Path. It was massive. It had countless arms folded in on its enormous body, rows of eyes closed across its dark skin, and a mouth that stretched too wide to look natural. In the larger canon of the world, that statue would much later be revealed as the husk of the Ten Tails, the original beast from which all 9 of the tailed beasts had been split off in the distant past. None of that history was known to Nagato in this moment. He only knew that something inside his eyes had answered his grief. He pulled chakra in a way he had never tried before. He summoned. The world around him bent briefly in a way that the Rain Country had never witnessed before. And out of that bend, the demonic statue rose into the small clearing where Yahiko had just died. Hanzo's forces had been ready for many things that day. They had not been ready for this. The statue was the size of a small mountain. Its stone fingers stretched up into the rain. Its sealed mouth opened slightly, just enough to release long lines of black chains that whipped through the air and gathered up dozens of soldiers at a time. The fighters Hanzo had brought with him were elite shinobi. Many of them had survived a great deal of war. None of it had prepared them for this. They were lifted off the ground. They were drained. They were destroyed in numbers that the Rain Country had not seen contained inside a single moment in living memory. Nagato, linked to the statue through his eyes and through the strange root that now connected his back to its body, paid for the technique with his own flesh. The demonic statue was not a free gift. It fed on the chakra and on the body of whoever was unwise enough to stay connected to it for long. As the soldiers were torn from the field, Nagato's legs began to wither beneath him. His skin began to lose its color. The bright red of his hair began to fade in patches. The body of a young man was being slowly traded away in exchange for the power to answer Yahiko's death in the only way Nagato could think to answer it. Hanzo, in the chaos, escaped. He had survived the 3 Sannin once. He had built his entire life on the discipline of leaving a battle alive when leaving was the right choice. He left this one too. Most of his forces did not. By the time the demonic statue settled back into the dimension from which it had come, the clearing was quiet again, and the rain was the only thing still moving across the bodies. Conan was free, Yahiko was dead, and Nagato could no longer stand on his own. Conan picked him up. She carried him out of the clearing on her own back, with Yahiko's body wrapped carefully and brought along for proper burial. She did not say very much during the long walk home. There was nothing useful to say. The 2 surviving children of the Rain Country had just lost the 3rd, and they had survived only because something terrible had been let out of the ground beneath their feet. Whatever came next was going to be built on that fact. What came next, in time, was the second Akatsuki, the one that the wider world would later remember. Nagato never walked again. The demonic statue had taken his legs in the most literal sense possible. They had withered down to thin, useless lines beneath him. Conan, with the careful patience that had always been her hallmark, helped him build a way to live with it. He could not move on his own anymore, but with the Rinnegan, he did not need to. He retreated into a hidden tower at the highest point of Amagakure, a tall, narrow building above the metal roofs of the city, and he allowed himself to be lifted into a strange chair. From his back, long black chakra rods extended into a frame of mechanical limbs that held him upright. Pipes ran into his body, feeding him chakra and nutrition. From that chair, with the help of Conan's quiet care, he could remain alive almost indefinitely. He would not need to walk. He would not need to move. He would govern the world below from this single high room, and the world below would never know he was there. The way he chose to govern was through 6 other bodies, controlled remotely, projected outward into the world the way a puppeteer projects intention into a puppet. He called them the 6 Paths of Pain. The technique itself was not a small one. The 6 paths required Nagato to insert chakra rods into 6 selected corpses, link those rods to his Rinnegan, and then send his consciousness out through them at a distance. Each body could be controlled independently. Each body retained the abilities it had possessed in life. And each body would be assigned one of the 6 aspects of the Sage's Eye, named after the 6 paths of reincarnation in older spiritual traditions. The Deva path could repel and attract objects with overwhelming gravitational force. The Asura path could mechanize its own body into a weapon. The human path could pull a target's soul out through their head and read every thought that soul had ever held. The animal path could summon a wide collection of creatures from another dimension. The Preta path could absorb almost any chakra technique aimed at it. And the Naraka path could interrogate and resurrect the other paths through a strange, judging head that rose from the ground at its will. 6 bodies, 6 aspects of the sage, 1 mind in a hidden tower directing them all. The first body Nagato chose for this technique was a body that had to be chosen. He chose it the way a man chooses to keep a wound open for a reason. He chose Yahiko. He took the body of his closest friend, the friend who had died smiling on his own kunai, the friend whose dream he had now sworn to carry the rest of the way, and he made it the central figure of the Six Paths. Yahiko's corpse, now pierced with chakra rods and slightly altered in appearance, became the Diva Path. He gave it the orange hair Yahiko had worn in life. He left the face mostly recognizable, and whenever the Akatsuki had to show a public leader to the world, that was the body the world would see. The world would not see Nagato. The world would see Yahiko, walking and speaking and ruling, with eyes that no longer belonged to him. Nagato had decided that Yahiko deserved to be the visible leader of the dream he had died for, even if the price of that decision was a kind of quiet horror that only Nagato and Konan would ever fully understand. He took the name Pain for this public face. He did not call himself Nagato anymore in front of anyone outside their tightest circle. He spoke through the Diva Path. The Diva Path's voice carried his words, though Nagato's actual lips moved in the hidden tower far above. The world began to know him only as Pain, the leader of the Akatsuki, and, in time, the ruler of Amigakure itself. Konan, in her own quiet way, became the angel of this new arrangement. She did not seek any title for herself. She managed Amigakure on a day-to-day level. She maintained the routines of the village, oversaw the small administrative tasks of a country, and stayed close to Nagato's tower so that he was never truly alone. The people of Amigakure, who had lived under Hanzo for so long, slowly came to revere her. They called her Angel because she moved through the wet streets quietly, often appearing high above on paper wings, and they called Pain God because his presence was felt without ever quite being seen. The worship was not always formal. It was something closer to a folk faith that grew up around the fact that, for the first time in living memory, the Rain Country was being defended by people who actually came from inside it. Hanzo, who had survived the ambush at the cost of his army, did not do well in the years that followed. His grip on Amigakure eroded steadily. The civil war that broke out as Pain consolidated control was largely one-sided, since the people of the country had no real reason to defend a leader who had betrayed his own youth. Years later, when Pain finally caught up with him in person, Hanzo had become a shadow of what he had once been. The fire had gone out of him. He had begun to suspect, in his old age, that he had been wrong about everything important. He did not put up much of a fight in their final encounter. He died with a quiet resignation that was almost worse than rage would have been. Pain became the unofficial leader of Amigakure. The country, for the first time in a long time, was protected by someone who actually loved it. The rain still fell. The metal towers still gleamed wet under the constant gray sky. But the suffering, at least the kind that came from outside armies trampling through, dropped sharply. The new Akatsuki was now established. It had a hidden tower. It had a Six Paths leader. It had Konan as its second, and it had a vision, drawn out of all that grief, that the world could only be made peaceful by being shown what real pain felt like, on a scale large enough that no nation would ever wish to start another war again. The shape of that vision, and the masked figure who had been quietly waiting in the shadows for exactly this moment to step forward, will be the center of the next section. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nagato has now been transformed, slowly and tragically, from the quiet boy of the hideout into the broken figure in the high tower above Amigakure, governing through 6 remote bodies and using his closest friend's corpse as the public face of his rule. The Akatsuki has become something new under his leadership, no longer a small group of community defenders, but a larger, darker organization with a vision built on suffering. In the next section, the story turns toward the masked stranger who first approached the original Akatsuki years ago, the man who claimed at that time to be Madara Uchiha, and the much larger plan that had been quietly waiting underneath the entire history of the Rain Country. From here, the lens widens beyond Amigakure itself, into the deeper machinery that had been moving the pieces all along. Section 5. The Masked Man and the Eye of the Moon Plan. The figure in the spiral mask had been standing at the edge of this story for a long time before anyone, even those closest to him, knew his real name. He had appeared once at the hideout of the original Akatsuki, alongside the strange plant creature Zetsu, and he had been turned away by Yahiko's plain refusal to trust anyone wearing a face that hid itself. He had not pressed the matter. He had simply withdrawn. Years had passed. Yahiko had died. Nagato had risen as Pain, and the masked man had returned, in the quiet aftermath of all that grief, with an offer that landed at exactly the moment a grieving leader was most willing to listen. He still called himself Madara Uchiha at this time. The name was a carefully chosen tool. The real Madara Uchiha had been one of the most legendary shinobi the world had ever produced, the co-founder of Konohagakure, alongside Hashirama Senju, the wielder of the Mangekyo Sharingan, who had supposedly died at the Valley of the End in a final battle against his old friend. Most of the world believed that Madara had been dead for decades. To wear his name was to wear the gravity of that long absence. It made the masked man speak with the weight of a ghost, and ghosts in the shinobi world were taken very seriously. The truth of who stood inside that mask was something that canon would only reveal much later in the larger story, and it should be approached gently here in the same order the manga presented it. The mask belonged to a young man named Obito Uchiha. His own life had been quiet, ordinary, and tragic in ways that did not seem at first to belong inside any plan as large as the one he eventually carried. He had grown up in Konoha. He had been on a genin team led by a man named Minato Namikaze, the future 4th Hokage, alongside 2 other young shinobi. One of those teammates had been a serious, stiff boy named Kakashi Hatake. The other had been a soft-hearted girl named Rin Nohara, with whom Obito had quietly fallen in love in the small, awkward way that 12-year-olds tend to fall in love. He had not been an exceptional student. He had been late to almost every meeting. He had carried himself with a mixture of clumsiness and stubborn good cheer that made him easy to dismiss. None of that mattered very much in the end, because of what happened during a single mission in the Third Shinobi World War that broke his life into pieces. The mission had taken his small team into a cave at the border of the Land of Earth. Rin had been captured by Iwa shinobi during the operation. Kakashi, by the rules of the Hidden Leaf, had been preparing to abandon her in favor of completing the mission. Obito had refused. He had gone to rescue Rin alone. Kakashi had eventually followed. The 2 of them had reached her, but the cave they were in was already collapsing around them. And in the final moments of that collapse, a piece of stone the size of a small house had come down onto Obito's right side. He had been crushed beneath it. Half of his body had been pinned. There had been no way to get him out. He had given Kakashi his other Sharingan eye in a final gesture of friendship, asked Kakashi to protect Rin, and then, with the cave still falling, he had urged the others to leave him behind. They had left him. Kakashi and Rin had returned to Konoha believing he was dead. He had not been dead. Crushed, dying, half-conscious, and beyond the reach of any normal rescue, he had been found by someone who should also not have been alive. The real Madara Uchiha, ancient by this point, kept barely breathing through a chakra connection to the same demonic statue that Nagato would one day summon, had pulled what remained of Obito out of the rubble. He had repaired the boy with a body grown from white Zetsu material, the same plant flesh that grew in the underground chamber where Madara himself was waiting to die. He had nursed him, he had fed him, and slowly, over a long, quiet time in that hidden chamber, he had begun to teach him. Obito did not initially want to learn. He wanted to leave. He wanted to return to Konoha, to Kakashi, to Rin, to the life he had been pulled away from. Madara let him want that for a while. Then circumstances above ground delivered Obito a wound from which he could not recover. The 2 boys he had once trusted, Kakashi and Rin, became caught up in a Kurigakure scheme to plant a tailed beast inside Konoha. Rin, in the cleanest, terrible logic of a girl who had decided that her own life mattered less than her village, threw herself onto Kakashi's lightning blade to prevent that scheme from succeeding. Obito had crawled out of the underground chamber just in time to see her die. The sight of it broke whatever was left of him. The world he had loved was now a world in which his teammate had killed the girl he loved. Even if Kakashi had not meant for it to happen, even if Rin had chosen it herself. The ordinary boy who had gone into the cave was gone. What walked back into Madara's chamber afterward was someone hollowed out, ready to listen, ready to take on a plan as large as the one Madara had been waiting to teach. The plan Madara taught him had a name. He called it the Eye of the Moon Plan. The basic shape of it was almost simple, even if the details were enormous. Madara had come to believe that the shinobi world, with its endless cycles of war, could not be reformed from inside. He believed that no agreement between villages would ever hold. He believed that nothing built out of human cooperation in the waking world would ever last. So he proposed something else. He proposed gathering all 9 of the tailed beasts, sealing them back into the demonic statue from which they had originally been split, reforming the original 10 tails, and making that beast's chakra usable through a single Jinchuriki host. With the power of that host, paired with the Rinnegan, A technique called the infinite Tsukuyomi could be cast against the surface of the moon. The moon itself would then reflect a single, overpowering genjutsu down across every living being on the planet. Everyone caught in that light would fall asleep into a perfect dream. They would dream the lives they had wanted but never received. They would feel safe. They would feel loved. They would feel whole. And in that dream, they would stay indefinitely, while the waking world was finally allowed to rest. It was a vision of peace built on the surrender of consciousness itself. Madara framed it as a mercy. He framed it as the only honest gift left for a world that had proven unable to govern itself. There was a deeper layer to that plan that Madara himself did not know, and it should be flagged here carefully because the canon only revealed it at the very end of the larger story. The vision Madara had read, the instructions on the ancient Uchiha tablet that had taught him about the Eye of the Moon plan in the first place, had not actually been written by the sage of the Six Paths. They had been altered, slowly and patiently, by a being called Black Zetsu, who was in fact the embodied will of an even older figure named Kaguya Otsutsuki. Black Zetsu had been waiting for centuries for someone strong enough to carry out a plan that would, at the very last step, allow Kaguya to be brought back into the world. Madara believed he was building peace. He was also, without realizing it, building a doorway. None of this would matter on the surface for a long time. It is mentioned here only because the masked man and the demonic statue and the rain country itself were all, in some quieter sense, pieces of a board that Black Zetsu had been arranging since before any of them were born. Madara, in his last years, knew he would not live to see his plan completed. He did the most practical thing he could think of. He passed it on. He had once, decades earlier, slipped his own Rinnegan into the body of a small Uzumaki infant in the rain country, so that those eyes would still exist somewhere in the world after his death. That infant had grown up to be Nagato. Now, from his dying bed in the underground chamber, Madara entrusted the larger plan to Obito, the broken young man he had spent these years patiently teaching. He told him what to do. He named the steps. He even gave him the particular figure to seek out as the next link in the chain. He told Obito to find Nagato, to befriend the Rain Country trio, and to slowly steer them toward the path that would eventually deliver the Rinnegan and the tailed beasts where they needed to go. Then Madara died. Obito, no longer ordinary, took up the work. He took the name Madara as a mask of his own. Since the legend of Madara opened doors that no other name in the world could open, he moved quietly. He approached the original Akatsuki at one stage, was rebuffed by Yahiko, and waited. He watched the trap unfold around the trio at Hanzo's hand. He watched Yahiko die. He watched Nagato lose his legs and his closest friend in a single afternoon. And then, when the grief had finally settled into something workable, he stepped forward again. He came to Nagato in the broken hours after the funeral. He spoke to him with the gentleness of a man who had once been crushed beneath a stone, too. He told Nagato that he understood. He told him that the dream Yahiko had died for was still possible. He told him about a way to force the world to listen, a way to gather a power so enormous that no nation could stand against it, a way to end war by making war impossible. He framed the Eye of the Moon plan in the language Nagato most needed to hear. He framed it as the natural next step of the dream Nagato had already inherited. Nagato accepted his guidance. He did not call himself a follower of the masked man, since on the surface, Pain remained the leader of the Akatsuki, but in private, the two of them came to an arrangement. The masked man would operate as the silent benefactor and second mind of the organization. Pain would handle the visible work. Conan, who never trusted the masked man, accepted the arrangement only because Nagato had. From that point onward, the Akatsuki was no longer just a peace movement that had hardened in grief. It was also, quietly, the operational arm of a plan that reached back to the time of the sage himself, even if almost no one inside the organization knew it. The masked man, in time, dropped the name Madara altogether in his day-to-day work. He took on a simpler alias, a small name suited to a flunky he could pretend to be when he wanted to walk among the Akatsuki without being noticed. He called this alias Toby. He used Toby to slip into the organization later, when an opening came among the regular members, and to operate from within as both a scout and a hidden steering hand. The world above ground would meet Toby as a clumsy, cheerful, almost comic figure. Only Nagato and Conan, and eventually a very small handful of others, would ever suspect that the man under the mask was the real architect of the larger plan moving the entire group forward. From here, the Akatsuki's mission would change in shape. It would no longer be about defending the Rain Country, or even about forcing peace through a single shocking act of violence. It would be about gathering the 9-tailed beasts, one by one, until the 10 tails could be reformed and the moon could be turned into a mirror for a dream that no one had asked for. The recruitment of S-rank criminals to do that work, and the strange, brilliant, broken people who answered the call, will be the focus of the sections that follow. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The shadow behind the Akatsuki has now been brought into the light, slowly and in the order the manga itself revealed it. From the spiral masked figure first turned away by Yahiko, to the broken young man underneath that mask, to the dying ancient teacher who passed the plan on, and finally, to the deeper hand of Black Zetsu, working underneath all of them. The Akatsuki's true mission has now been quietly redirected, even if most of its future members will never learn what they are really being recruited into. In the next section, the story moves to the most famous of those future members, a young Uchiha whose own night of terrible decisions had already turned him into one of the most wanted criminals in the world, long before the Akatsuki ever found him. From here, the lens turns toward Itachi Uchiha, and the massacre that bought a single village a fragile, complicated peace. Section 6. Itachi Uchiha and the massacre behind the mask. The story now turns far away from the rain country, across hundreds of kilometers of forest and mountain, into the wide, shaded valleys that had grown up around the village known to the wider world as Konohagakure. The Hidden Leaf was the largest, oldest, and most stable of the 5 great shinobi villages, founded generations earlier by a quiet alliance between 2 of the most legendary clans the world had ever produced. One of those clans was the Senju, the line of the man called Hashirama, who had become the first Hokage. The other was the Uchiha, the line of Madara, the same Madara whose name had recently been worn as a mask in the Rain Country. The 2 clans had hated each other for centuries before Hashirama and Madara, against all expectation, sat down together and drew up the borders of a single shared village, in the hope that their children would not have to keep killing each other forever. That hope held for a while. It did not hold forever. Madara had broken with Hashirama early in the village's life, accusing the Senju of slowly squeezing the Uchiha out of any meaningful share in governance, and the wound he had opened with that accusation never quite closed. Even after Madara's apparent death at the Valley of the End, the suspicion he had spoken aloud continued to live underneath the village like a quiet root. The Uchiha kept rising into positions of importance. The Uchiha kept being watched. The other clans of Konoha kept smiling at them in public meetings and keeping a careful distance in private. By the time Itachi Uchiha was born, the wound had been there for most of a century, and the village had learned to live with it the way people learn to live with an old injury that aches whenever the weather changes. The weather changed when Itachi was very small. On the night Sasuke was born, his younger brother by several years, the 9 tails attacked Konoha. The beast tore through entire neighborhoods. Many shinobi died. The 4th Hokage, a man named Minato Namikaze, sealed the beast inside his own newborn son at the cost of his own life. The village survived, barely, and in the long, quiet investigation that followed, the leadership of Konoha came to a conclusion they did not say in public, but which they put into action in every way that mattered. They decided that the Uchiha had been responsible. The reasoning was thin, since the Uchiha as a whole had not in fact orchestrated the attack. The truth, much later revealed, was that a single masked figure carrying the Sharingan had used that eye to control the beast for a single terrible night, and that masked figure was not part of the clan in any working sense. None of that was known at the time. What was known was that the Sharingan was the only known dojutsu in the world capable of controlling a tailed beast, and the only people in the world who carried the Sharingan were the Uchiha. The leadership of Konoha drew their lines. Quietly, without ever announcing the decision in any official way, they relocated the entire Uchiha clan to a single isolated district at the edge of the village. They put police work into the clan's hands as a way to keep them visible and contained. They watched them. They no longer trusted them. And the clan, in turn, slowly came to understand that the village it had helped found no longer wanted it as a true partner. Itachi grew up inside that resentment. He was the eldest son of Fugaku Uchiha, the head of the clan, and Mikoto Uchiha, a quiet, steady woman who had once been close friends with the late Kushina Uzumaki, Naruto's mother. From his earliest years, he was extraordinary in the small, specific ways that prodigies tend to be extraordinary. He noticed things. He thought through situations the way an adult might. He listened more than he spoke. He had a younger brother, Sasuke, whom he loved with a quiet, protective intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. since Itachi was not generally an open person. He had also seen war very early. As a small boy, before he was old enough to be a shinobi himself, he had been taken out of the village to a battlefield during the closing days of the Third Shinobi World War. The sight of that battlefield had marked him in a way he never spoke about openly. He had seen what people did to each other when systems failed. He had seen the bodies. He had seen the small, absurd cruelties that came with large wars. From that day forward, even as he trained to be a shinobi himself, Itachi carried inside him a quiet, settled hatred for war that was much older than his own years. He believed, in the careful, private way that thoughtful children sometimes believe, that any future war should be prevented at almost any personal cost. He moved through the systems of Konoha very fast. He entered the academy at age 7 and graduated within a year. He awakened the Sharingan at age 8. He passed the Chunin exams at 10. He was admitted into the ANBU, the village's covert special operations unit, at age 11, and he was given his own squad before he was 14. The leadership of the village considered him the brightest Uchiha child they had seen in a generation. The leadership of the clan considered him the future of the entire family. Both groups, in their own ways, were already planning how to use him. The plan inside the clan, which Fugaku quietly disclosed to his eldest son when he believed he was finally ready, was a coup. Years of being watched and isolated had hardened the Uchiha's resentment into something operational. Fugaku and the senior members of the clan had decided that the only way to restore their place in the village was to take the village. They were preparing, slowly and carefully, to overthrow the Hokage and replace the leadership of Konoha with themselves. They asked Itachi, given his unique position in the ANBU, to act as their inside man. He agreed, in the soft, careful way he agreed to most things. The plan inside the village leadership was different, and it had its own weight. The current Hokage, the third, Hiruzen Sarutobi, was a man who hated the idea of internal violence, and who kept hoping that careful diplomacy could prevent the coup from ever ripening into action. He sent Itachi back into the clan as a double agent in the other direction, hoping to slow the conspiracy from inside. Beside Hiruzen, however, sat Danzo Shimura, the same Danzo who had once helped Hanzo of the Salamander set the trap on Yahiko in the Rain Country years earlier. Danzo did not believe in slow diplomacy. He believed that a problem that had begun to organize itself had to be cut out before it grew further. He pulled Itachi aside, in the quiet rooms where Root operated, and gave him a different set of orders. The orders were impossible to carry without breaking forever. Danzo, with the cold, practical reasoning that had defined his entire life, told Itachi that the time for a peaceful resolution had passed. He told him that the coup would tear Konoha into a civil war the village could not survive, and that other shinobi nations, sensing the weakness, would invade and finish the rest. He told Itachi that the only way to spare the village from that fate was to remove the Uchiha clan in a single decisive night before the coup could be launched. He told Itachi that he, alone, would have to be the instrument of that removal. Itachi listened. He understood. He understood that Danzo was offering him the worst choice a person could be offered, and that the calculus underneath the choice was, in its terrible way, sound. He had grown up watching the village he loved drift toward an internal war that he himself had once trained to fight. He had grown up watching the clan he loved harden into a posture that would, if completed, kill thousands of innocent people across multiple villages. He weighed the two outcomes with the steady clarity that had always made adults uncomfortable around him. And then, he negotiated. He told Danzo that he would carry out the order. He had one condition. His brother Sasuke, who had no part in the coup and no understanding of any of it, was to be spared. The village leadership was to leave Sasuke alone, forever, and let him grow up as an ordinary child of Konoha. Danzo, who had wanted the entire clan removed without exceptions, agreed only because he had no real ability to refuse. Itachi was the only person in the village capable of carrying out the operation cleanly. The deal was struck. There was a single piece of help available to him for the actual night, and it came from a direction no one in Konoha would have predicted. The masked man who had once approached the Rain Country still moved across the world, watching for openings to advance the larger plan he had inherited. He had been watching the Uchiha clan with quiet interest, since the Sharingan and the Mangekyo Sharingan were both deeply useful tools to that plan. He approached Itachi privately. He offered to help with the operation. Itachi, who did not trust him in any deeper sense, accepted his help only because he needed it. The two of them, on a single dark night, moved through the Uchiha district together. Most of the clan died at Itachi's hand. The masked man covered the rest. Itachi did not kill his parents in any cold way. He spoke to them first. Fugaku and Mikoto, in the small, quiet moment before their deaths, told him that they understood, that they were proud of him, that they loved him no matter what he was about to do, and that they trusted him to take care of Sasuke. They knelt with their backs to him so that he would not have to look them in the face. He cried. He killed them. He did not allow himself to break. When Sasuke came home that night, Itachi performed the role he believed his brother would need from him. He played the cold, older brother. He showed Sasuke the bodies. He told Sasuke, in language calculated to wound permanently, that Sasuke had been spared because he was too weak to be worth killing, and that his only purpose now was to grow strong enough to one day return and avenge the clan. He gave him a hatred to carry, since he believed that hatred would be easier for a small boy to carry than the truth. Then, he left Konoha. The village announced him as a traitor. He was added to the international bingo books as an S-rank missing nin. The Akatsuki, which had been watching for exactly this kind of recruit, reached him quickly. He was assigned a partner named Juzo Biwa, a former member of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Mist, who had defected from his own village. The two of them worked together for a time, until Juzo was killed in a clash with the 4th Mizukage. Itachi was then paired with another defector from the Mist, a tall, broad-shouldered shinobi with sharp teeth and a sword that ate chakra. That shinobi's name was Kisame Hoshigaki, and the partnership between the two of them would last almost until the end of the story. Inside the Akatsuki, Itachi carried a secret that he never told to anyone in the organization. His real loyalty was still to Konoha. The deal he had struck with the 3rd Hokage on his way out of the village had included a quiet arrangement. Itachi would join the Akatsuki, gather information from inside, and use his position to keep the organization's most violent attentions away from his home village for as long as possible. He would protect Sasuke from a distance. He would bide his time. And one day, when the moment was right, he would let his younger brother find him and kill him in a clean, visible duel, so that Sasuke could return home with his hatred fulfilled and the truth could be quietly given back to him. The illness that was already growing inside Itachi's lungs, an old chronic condition no medication had been able to fully control, made the timing of that final duel into a real countdown. He had years. He did not have many. So the figure the Akatsuki recruited was not a simple villain. He was a young man who had already saved his village once at the cost of his own name, and who was now waiting patiently inside the most feared organization in the world for the chance to do it again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Itachi has now been placed inside the story in his full complexity, as the prodigy who carried out the worst night of his clan's history in order to spare his village a worse war. As the older brother who built his younger brother into an avenger out of love rather than cruelty, and as the quietest spy in the entire Akatsuki, sitting at meetings beside men who would have killed him on the spot if they had known what he really was. In the next section, the story turns to the partner who walked beside him through almost all of those years, the broad-shouldered swordsman from the Hidden Mist, whose own loyalty had been broken in a different way, and to two other figures whose violent arts, in their own strange ways, defined the shape of the Akatsuki's middle years. From here, the lens moves to Kisame Hoshigaki, the puppet master Sasori, and the explosive young man named Deidara. Section 7. Kisame, Sasori, and Deidara. The man who walked beside Itachi through almost the entire span of the Akatsuki's hunting years was a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose appearance unsettled almost everyone who crossed paths with him. His skin had a faint blue tint, his eyes were small and pale, and his teeth, when he smiled or spoke, came to fine, sharpened points like a deep-water predator. He carried a wrapped bundle on his back that was very nearly his own height, a sword the world would later come to fear by name. His own name was Kisame Hoshigaki, and his home, before the Akatsuki, had been the village known as Kirigakure, the Hidden Mist. Kirigakure, in those years, had a reputation that the wider world spoke of only in lowered voices. It had earned a second name during the long reign of its 4th Mizukage, a small framed man called Yagura Karatachi, and that second name was the Bloody Mist. Under Yagura, the village's policies had hardened in ways that crossed every line a shinobi village was supposed to maintain. Children in the academy were forced, as a graduation exercise, to fight one another to the death in single combat. Loyalty was tested through a steady stream of small cruelties. Shinobi who showed any sign of doubt about the village's direction were quietly removed. The truth which the wider world would not learn until much later, was that Yagura himself had been placed under the influence of the masked man's Sharingan from the Rain Country, and the Bloody Mist policies were not entirely his own. The shinobi of the mist did not know that. They lived inside a system that punished them for any honest reaction to it. Kisame had grown up inside that system. He had become one of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, the elite sword wielders whose blades were each named and famous in their own right. His blade was Samehada, a long, scaled, almost living thing that rippled when it was moved, and that, when unwrapped, revealed itself to be covered in countless small, interlocking shark teeth. Samehada was sentient in some quiet, limited sense. It chose its wielders. It had chosen Kisame, and it had a particular gift that made it one of the most dangerous swords in the world. It did not cut in any normal sense. It tore. It also fed on the chakra of whatever it tore into, returning that chakra to its wielder. A single hit from Samehada could leave an enemy weakened, exhausted, and slowly drained, even if the cut itself was small. Kisame's most painful memory, the one that broke whatever loyalty he still had to the mist, came from a mission inside his own village. He had been ordered to kill a small group of his own comrades after it was revealed they had been selling secrets to a foreign power. He had carried out the order. He had killed them himself, in person, with his own hands. And then he had learned, in the long, quiet aftermath, that the secrets they had been selling were not real secrets. The whole leak had been a manufactured test of his loyalty. His comrades had been killed for nothing, by him, on the orders of the village he had served. Something inside him broke that day. The small core of belief that had kept him fighting under the Bloody Mist's banner finally collapsed. He concluded that the world he had been fighting for was a world built on lies, that every village told its shinobi stories to control them, and that no system on the planet could be trusted to mean what it said. The masked man found him in that broken state, the way the masked man always seemed to find people in their broken states. He did not have to convince Kisame of much. He simply offered him a vision. He spoke about a world without lies, a world where all the small, careful deceptions that nations built between themselves and their soldiers would finally be wiped away, a world where everyone could see the truth at the same time. To Kisame, who had just been forced to kill his own friends for a fictional crime, the offer landed clean. He accepted. He defected from the mist. He joined the Akatsuki under the masked man's quiet direction. And although he spent the rest of his life inside an organization run on its own deeper deceptions, the small private dream of a world without lies stayed with him until the very end. He was paired, after the death of Itachi's first partner, with Itachi himself. The two of them were an unlikely match. Kisame was loud, blunt, and physically overwhelming. Itachi was soft-spoken, slight, and almost monkish in his quiet. They got along better than anyone expected. Kisame admired Itachi's calm in a way he could not fully explain to himself. He took Itachi's instructions without arguing, even when the instructions kept him from killing people he would otherwise have enjoyed killing. The reserves of chakra Kisame carried were so enormous that other shinobi sometimes called him a tailless, tailed beast, a small, grim joke about the fact that he could outlast most Jinchuriki in a long battle, simply by having more fuel in his body than any human should reasonably possess. He never grew arrogant about it. He simply did the work. Beside Kisame in the rotating partnerships of the Akatsuki's middle years was a very different figure. That figure called himself, when he answered to anything at all, Sasori of the Red Sand. He had been born in Tsunagakure, the Hidden Sand, and he carried the smaller, drier accent of that desert village. He was, by the time the world met him, a puppet. The body the world saw was carved wood and lacquered shell. Beneath it, hidden inside a small cylinder set into the chest, was the only piece of him that still belonged to the man he had once been, a single beating heart still wrapped in a thin patch of his original flesh. His backstory was older and sadder than his appearance suggested. Sasori had been a small child when his parents died on a mission for the sand. The shinobi who had killed them was a Konoha Jonin called Sakumo Hatake, a man so famous in his prime that the world had given him the name the White Fang. Sasori had been raised after that loss by his grandmother, an old woman named Chiyo, who was a master of the puppet techniques for which the sand was famous. Chiyo had taught him puppetry in part to give him a craft, and in part to give him company, since the small boy had no parents left to play with. She had not anticipated how seriously he would take it. Sasori had built, while still a child, a pair of puppets that resembled his lost parents, and that could embrace him with mechanical arms. He had used those puppets for comfort during the years when the rest of the world expected him to be growing past his grief. The grief had not gone past. It had only gone underground. He grew into one of the most gifted puppeteers Sunagakure had ever produced. He developed techniques the village had never seen before. He created an entire arsenal of puppets, each modified from the body of a real shinobi he had killed, each preserved through a process he had perfected over years of careful work. His most famous puppet was made from the body of the third Kazekage, a leader he had defeated in a quiet operation that the sand never managed to fully explain to itself. Eventually, after a long internal drift away from the village, Sasori defected. He took his collection of puppets with him. He walked away from the only family he had left, and from the grandmother who had taught him everything. The final step in his transformation was the one that disturbed almost everyone who later learned of it. Sasori, having concluded that art was a form of beauty made eternal, decided that his own body was the wrong material for art. Flesh aged, flesh died. Flesh gave way to weakness in moments where strength was needed, so he replaced it. He converted his own body into a puppet, piece by piece, until only that single cylinder of original heart remained. He made himself into the very thing he loved to build. He believed that this transformation had made him perfect, since he could now, in theory, last forever. Sasori joined the Akatsuki not long after the second iteration of the organization formed. He was paired, in those early years, with Orochimaru, the Konoha Sannin, who would later defect from the Akatsuki himself. The two of them worked together in some efficient way that neither of them ever fully described in public. After Orochimaru left, Sasori was reassigned. He waited, in a quiet hideout, for whoever the leadership would choose as his next partner. The choice, when it came, was a young man so loud and so insufferable that Sasori almost killed him in their first week together. The young man's name was Deidara. He was from Iwagakure, the Hidden Stone, and he had been a member of that village's explosion corps before defecting. His specialty was a strange and specific bloodline ability that had made him famous and feared inside his own village. Deidara had mouths in his palms, and a third in the center of his chest. Those mouths chewed clay. The clay, kneaded with his chakra, became sculpted figures of all sizes, from small clay birds the size of a fist to massive flying clay creatures the size of small buildings. Each sculpture, when triggered with a hand seal and a single shouted word, exploded with force matched to its size. The smallest could rupture a wall, the largest could destroy entire neighborhoods. He had been recruited under unusual circumstances. The Akatsuki had sent Itachi, Kisame, and Sasori to bring him in. Deidara, who carried his arrogance like a banner, had refused to come quietly. He had offered, in his cocky way, a contest. Itachi had accepted. Itachi had defeated him almost without effort, using the Sharingan to trap him in an illusion that left him with no real way to refuse the original offer. Deidara had carried the humiliation of that loss with him for the rest of his life. He hated the Sharingan from that day onward. He spent years working on counter techniques, special types of clay, special kinds of vision, anything that might let him beat a Sharingan if he ever got the chance to face one again. He believed, with the same total commitment that Sasori brought to his own opposite belief, that art was an explosion. Art was beauty in its instant, in the single sharp moment of brightness when something magnificent burst into the air and was gone. Art was not eternal. Art was fleeting by its very nature, and any attempt to preserve it killed the thing that made it art. He said this often, in front of Sasori, who was a walking eternal puppet. Sasori, who believed art was eternal preservation, replied with the same disagreement every time. The two of them argued about it whenever they were not working. Neither ever convinced the other. They were paired together for a long stretch of the Akatsuki's middle years, and the partnership functioned the way many Akatsuki partnerships functioned, through mutual annoyance held together by mutual professional respect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The middle members of the Akatsuki have now been laid out in their full, strange shapes, with the broken loyalist from the Bloody Mist who longed for a world without lies, the puppet master who had turned his own body into the thing he loved to build, and the loud, explosive artist whose entire philosophy ran in the opposite direction of his own partners. The organization has begun to feel less like a single, united force, and more like a collection of damaged people who happen to have agreed, for very different reasons, to walk in the same direction. In the next section, the lens turns to four more figures who deepen that pattern even further. The immortal zealot, the the century-old thief of hearts, the strange plant creature who had been there from the very beginning, and the white-haired Sannin, who had once stood beside Jiraiya in the Rain Country, and who now stood, briefly, inside the Akatsuki itself. Section 8. Hidan, Kakuzu, Zetsu, and Orochimaru. The Akatsuki by this stage had taken on the shape it would carry for most of its remaining years. There were 10 members at any given time, by design, and each member was paired with another, also by design. The pairings were not built around friendship, they were built around utility. Two shinobi placed together in the field could cover each other's weaknesses, hold off larger groups, and complete missions that a single member might fail. The leadership of the organization, which on the surface meant pain, and on the deeper level meant the masked man, watched these pairings carefully and adjusted them whenever circumstances demanded. Some pairs grew into something almost like comradeship over time. Some pairs spent years openly hating each other while still functioning as a team. The story now turns to 4 members whose own personalities pulled the organization further away from any simple definition of what it was supposed to be. The first of them was a young man with slicked-back silver hair, pale violet eyes, and a habit of speaking in long, profane streams that almost no one in the organization wanted to listen to. His name was Hidan. He had come from a small, forgotten village called Yugakure, the hidden hot water, which had once been a normal shinobi village, and had quietly decided, at some point in its history, to give up the shinobi business altogether and reinvent itself as a tourist destination. By the time Hidan was old enough to have an opinion, the village he had grown up in had become a chain of bathhouses and resort hotels, with no remaining ninja tradition worth defending. The transformation infuriated him. He had wanted to be a warrior in the old sense. He had wanted his village to mean something. Instead, it had become a cheerful place where outsiders came to soak in hot water and admire the local mountains. His response to that disappointment was extreme, even by the standards of the Akatsuki. He found, in his wandering, a small religious cult dedicated to a god called Joshin. The faith of Joshin was a faith built around suffering. Its central command, given to its followers, was that every person they met had to either be killed or be hurt. Anything less than that was considered a sin against the god. Hidan accepted the faith completely. He killed his way through every neighbor he had ever known in Yugakure, because their soft tourist lives were, in his view, a personal insult to the god he now served. Then he left the village behind and wandered the wider world looking for fights. Joshin, in return for that kind of devotion, gave Hidan a strange gift. He became immortal in a particular sense of the word. His body could be cut, broken, severed, decapitated, and pierced through, and he would not die. He would feel pain. He would even bleed. But the wounds, no matter how grievous, would not finish him. Combined with that immortality was the central technique of his faith, a long ritual in which he drew a circle on the ground in his enemy's blood, stood inside it, and drove a long pike into his own body. Whatever he did to himself inside that circle, the enemy whose blood it was drawn in would feel through their own flesh, in the same place, with the same force. He could kill almost anyone with that ritual once he had a single drop of their blood. It was a slow, painful, deeply unpleasant technique to watch. He enjoyed every step of it. He was recruited into the Akatsuki after a brief skirmish with a hunting party that included Konan, Itachi, and another Akatsuki member he would soon be paired with. Hidan, with the cheerful self-assurance that defined him, picked a fight with that other member and managed, in the chaos, to destroy one of the man's hearts. The detail that would have ended the encounter for any normal person did not faze Hidan, who could not be killed in any meaningful way, and the hunting party found themselves looking at a young man whose particular skill set fit perfectly with the partner whose heart he had just removed. Konan offered him a place. He accepted, partly out of curiosity and partly because he liked the idea of working alongside someone he had just hurt. The faith of Joshin in his mind was satisfied either way. The partner he was placed with was, in many respects, his exact opposite. The man's name was Kakuzu. He was tall, broad, and very old. His skin had a strange dark gray tone, with thick black thread visible across his arms, his face, and the corners of his mouth. He wore a hood pulled close over his head, a mask drawn up to just beneath his eyes, and a long Akatsuki cloak buttoned tight across a body that did not sit quite right inside it. He spoke rarely. When he spoke, every word was either about money or about the inefficiency of someone else's behavior. His story reached back further than almost any other living member of the Akatsuki. Kakuzu had been born in Takigakure, the hidden waterfall, and he had grown into one of his village's strongest shinobi, during a period long before the founding of most other modern villages. At one point in his early career, he had been sent on a mission so impossible that no honest leader should have given it to him. He had been ordered to assassinate Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, the man who could grow forests out of bare ground with a single hand seal. Kakuzu had attempted the mission. He had failed, since almost no one in the world could have completed it. He had returned to Takigakure, expecting at least a measure of understanding for the difficulty of what he had been asked to do. Instead, the elders of his village had punished him brutally for the failure, stripping him of his rank and ordering him to be executed. He had escaped. He had taken from his village's vault, on the way out, a forbidden technique that would shape the rest of his unnatural life. The technique was called Earth Grudge Fear. It allowed its user to remove a person's heart, alive and beating, through long black threads that emerged from the user's own body, and to install that heart into themselves as a second source of life. Each additional heart extended the user's lifespan. Each heart also brought with it the elemental affinity of its previous owner, which meant that a user with multiple hearts could deploy elemental jutsu from each of them in sequence. Kakuzu had used the technique constantly, across nearly 100 years of life. He had killed countless shinobi simply to take the hearts in their chests. By the time he joined the Akatsuki, he carried 5 hearts inside him, 4 borrowed and 1 original, each housed in a separate woven body that he could deploy outside his own form, like a strange spider. He was, in effect, several people at once. He had also killed every previous partner the Akatsuki had given him. He killed them in fits of rage, often over small disagreements about money, sometimes over even smaller disagreements about pace and efficiency. The leadership had grown tired of replacing his partners, so they paired him with Hidan, who could not be killed even if Kakuzu tried. The two of them, predictably, despised each other. Hidan considered Kakuzu's obsession with money to be sacrilegious in front of Joshin. Kakuzu considered Hidan's long rituals to be a daily insult to the value of efficient time management. They argued constantly. They threatened to kill each other constantly. And yet, in the field, they were one of the most effective teams the organization had ever produced. Kakuzu could launch wide elemental attacks without worrying about hitting Hidan, since Hidan would survive them. Hidan could perform his slow rituals in the open without worrying about being interrupted, since Kakuzu was usually behind him eating through the surrounding enemies. The pair was nicknamed by other members of the organization the Zombie Combo. Beside these two, in the strange roster of the Akatsuki, was a creature whose nature did not match anything else in the world. His name, when anyone bothered to call him by name, was Zetsu. He was, in the way the eyes saw him, a single person split down the middle. The right half of his body was white, the left half was black, and a large green plant structure rose around his head and shoulders like a hood made of something halfway between flesh and leaves. He spoke with 2 voices, sometimes simultaneously and sometimes in rotation. The white half was casual and friendly, almost cheerful. The black half was cold and calculating, almost clinical. Zetsu's deeper truth was different from anything the rest of the Akatsuki understood about him, and it should be flagged here in the order the manga itself revealed it. The white half had been created, slowly and over a long span of time, from the bodies of fallen shinobi who had been absorbed into the demonic statue across many wars. He was, in some sense, a composite of the dead. He was not unique either, since the masked man's underground chamber held an entire silent army of identical white Zetsu figures, grown from that same source, kept in reserve for the 4th Great Shinobi War that the masked man was quietly building toward. The black half had a much older and much darker origin. He was, in his deepest reality, the embodied will of an ancient figure named Kaguya Otsutsuki, the original wielder of chakra in the world, and his entire purpose across centuries had been to manipulate the descendants of that figure toward bringing her back to life. Black Zetsu had been the one who had altered the Uchiha tablet that Madara had read. He had been the one who had set the Eye of the Moon plan in motion in the first place. He was, in the purest sense of the word, the oldest and most patient hand on the board. Inside the day-to-day operations of the Akatsuki, none of that was visible. Zetsu, in his combined form, served as the organization's spy, scout, and cleaner. He could phase through the ground itself, melting his body into the soil and resurfacing miles away. He could observe distant battles from inside walls and trees. He could finish off bodies after fights, a habit that gave rise to the unsettling Akatsuki joke that he sometimes ate the dead. Pain trusted him as a source of intelligence. The masked man trusted him as a quiet partner in the larger plan. Most other members tolerated him as a strange, unsettling presence at meetings. None of them, except possibly the masked man, understood what he really was. The last figure to be covered in this section had come and gone from the Akatsuki before the events of the main story even began. His name was Orochimaru, and he had once been one of the 3 Sannin of Konoha. Alongside Jiraiya and Tsunade, he had stood on the Rain Country battlefield decades earlier when Hanzo of the Salamander had given the 3 of them their famous title. He had been a brilliant student, a natural genius at almost every form of shinobi technique, and at one stage of his life, he had been considered the most likely candidate to inherit the title of Hokage from the 3rd. None of that path held. Orochimaru's curiosity about the deeper machinery of life and death had drifted over many years into experiments that no village could allow. He had captured shinobi and civilians for testing. He had cultivated a fascination with bodies that approached real evil. The 3rd Hokage had eventually discovered the experiments, had failed to bring himself to kill his old student in person, and had simply allowed Orochimaru to flee. Orochimaru drifted through the missing Nin world for a stretch of years, and was eventually picked up by the Akatsuki during the early consolidation of its 2nd iteration. He was paired with Sasori. The 2 of them, by Sasori's own later account, worked well together in their narrow, specific way. Both of them were obsessed with the manipulation of bodies. Both of them were uninterested in attachment. Both of them respected technical precision more than personal warmth. The partnership lasted until Itachi joined. The arrival of Itachi gave Orochimaru the only thing he had ever really wanted in the Akatsuki. He had been searching for most of his adult life for a body strong enough to host his own consciousness through the dark transfer technique he had developed. The Sharingan was the most coveted bloodline in the world for that purpose, since it could let its wielder learn any technique they ever saw. Orochimaru attempted to take Itachi's body. Itachi was significantly stronger than Orochimaru had expected. The attempt failed. Orochimaru, knowing that the Akatsuki would not forgive a member who tried to murder another member from inside, fled the organization. He took with him his Akatsuki ring, the small numbered piece of jewelry that each member wore as a token of their slot. The ring went with him into the rest of the story, into his own separate ambitions, into the founding of his own hidden village, and into his complicated long-term role as both an enemy and an occasional ally to the larger world. Because the ring left with Orochimaru, the Akatsuki could not simply replace him. The slot stayed empty for a stretch of years. Sasori, his old partner, stayed without a partner during that gap. The organization was technically operating below its full strength. It was during this lull that the masked man saw an opportunity to slip in personally. He took on the simple flunky alias Toby, presented himself as a clumsy but eager applicant, and quietly waited for the next opening to declare himself. Deidara would later be brought in to fill Orochimaru's empty slot beside Sasori, with a freshly forged version of the original ring. The Akatsuki, on paper, was complete again. Underneath the paper, almost nothing was what it appeared to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The roster of the Akatsuki has now been laid out in its full, strange completeness, with the immortal zealot of the Hot Water Village, the century-old thief of hearts from the hidden waterfall, the plant creature whose deeper nature reached back to a figure older than the world itself, and the brilliant defector from the hidden leaf, whose brief time inside the organization left a hole that would shape the partnerships of its later years. The pieces are all on the board now. The plan is moving. The recruitment is finished. In the next section, the long, quiet years of preparation finally end, and the Akatsuki steps fully into the open, beginning its slow, patient hunt for the 9-tailed beasts and the Jinchuriki who carried them. From here, the story turns toward the missions themselves, toward the deaths that came one after another inside that hunt, and toward the moment when the organization's most public face, Pain himself, finally turned his attention toward the village of Konohagakure. Section 9. The Tailed Beast Hunt and the Fall of Pain. The Akatsuki did not begin its open hunt for the tailed beasts immediately. There was a long, quiet period between the end of the recruitment phase and the start of the operation itself, a period the canon refers to as a time of biding. Roughly 2 years passed in this lull. The world above ground believed, during those 2 years, that the Akatsuki had gone dormant, perhaps even disbanded. Bingo books still listed its members as wanted criminals, but actual sightings of the cloaks with red clouds became rare. The 5 great villages allowed themselves, slowly, to relax their watch on the organization. Other concerns crowded in. The Sound Village rose under Orochimaru's leadership and drew attention away from the Akatsuki. The Sand Village quietly rebuilt after a period of internal trouble. The Mist Village began the slow work of recovering from the long shadow of the Bloody Mist era. The wider shinobi world drifted into a fragile, distracted sort of peace. Inside the organization, those 2 years were not idle. The masked man and Pain spent them refining the technique that would actually do the work of the operation. The demonic statue, the same enormous figure that had risen out of the rain country during Yahiko's death, was the instrument of the plan. Each of the 9-tailed beasts, once captured, had to be sealed into the statue through a single long collective ritual called the sealing technique of the Phantom Dragon's 9 consuming seals. The ritual required 9 of the 10 members of the Akatsuki to stand on the carved fingertips of the statue at the same time and channel chakra together over a period of roughly 3 days and nights. During the ritual, the captured Jinchuriki would die slowly, their chakra drained out of them and pulled into the statue, until only the empty body of a former host remained. The technique could not be performed with fewer than the required number of members. It also could not be hurried. The organization, therefore, had to be careful about which members were lost during the operation, since each loss made the remaining sealings harder to complete. The order of the hunt was decided patiently. The masked man and Pain studied the locations of all 9 Jinchuriki. They studied the political stability of the villages those Jinchuriki lived in. They studied the personal habits of the carriers themselves. They chose to begin with the one tail, Shukaku, who had been sealed into the body of a young man named Gaara, the recently appointed 5th Kazekage of Sunagakure. Gaara was the youngest Kage in the world. He was also, by Sasori's own quiet judgment, accessible. Sasori had connections inside the sand from his own old life there. Deidara, his partner at this stage, had the explosive techniques needed to deal with whatever resistance the sand might mount. The 2 of them were sent. The mission to capture Gaara succeeded on the operational level and failed on the personal level. Deidara reached Suna by air on one of his enormous clay birds and engaged Gaara in the sky above the village. Gaara was an extraordinarily powerful Jinchuriki even at his young age, and the fight stretched longer than Deidara had expected. He lost his left arm during the engagement to Gaara's sand. He still won. Gaara fell from the sky, exhausted past the point of consciousness, and was taken away. The village of Suna scrambled to mount a rescue. So did Konoha. A combined team formed quickly. Naruto Uzumaki, Sakura Haruno, Kakashi Hatake, and an old retired puppet master named Chiyo, the same Chiyo who had once taught Sasori the puppet arts as a small child, all moved out to bring Gaara back. What followed was one of the longest and most emotionally complex operations of the entire hunt. Deidara was eventually engaged by Naruto and Kakashi in a chase that broke through forests and mountains. Sasori, in his Haruko puppet shell, was confronted by Sakura and Chiyo at an underground hideout. The fight between Sasori and his own grandmother was the kind of fight that should not have happened, since Chiyo had loved him through every long year of her life, and had never stopped grieving the small boy he had been before he had remade himself into a puppet. She fought him anyway. She used every puppet technique she had taught him as a child against him. Sakura supported her with the chakra control she had inherited from Tsunade. The fight ended with Sasori, in the small last moment of it, allowing himself to be killed. He had grown tired in some quiet way that he would not have admitted earlier in his life. He had also, in his deepest hidden self, never quite forgiven himself for what he had done to his own body. Chiyo held his original heart cylinder in her hands as he died. She closed his eyes. He told her, with what almost passed for a smile, that he had left the inside of his body open to a single weakness for years, in case anyone he still loved ever decided to use it. He died in her arms. Gaara, by the time the rescue team caught up, had already been drained to the point of death, but Chiyo, in her final act, transferred her own life into him and brought him back. Gaara survived. Deidara escaped, missing an arm, by riding out on a clay clone. The organization had its first tailed beast. It had also lost its first member. The opening that Sasori's death created was the one the masked man had been waiting for. He stepped forward, presenting himself as the cheerful applicant Tobi, and joined the active roster of the Akatsuki under that alias. He was paired with Deidara, much to Deidara's continuing irritation. The 2 of them, an obvious mismatch on the surface, captured the 3 tails together not long after. The work moved forward. Around the same time, the immortal pair was sent after the 2 tails. Hidan and Kakuzu reached the Jinchuriki, a woman named Yugito Nii of Kumogakure, and brought her in for sealing. They would have continued cleanly into further missions if the next encounter had gone as smoothly. It did not. While operating inside the Land of Fire, the pair came into contact with a Konoha team led by Asuma Sarutobi, a calm, chain-smoking jonin who served on the 12 Guardian Ninja and who taught the team that included Shikamaru Nara. Hidan, in the long ritual style that defined him, killed Asuma during that engagement. Shikamaru, who had loved his teacher in the careful, quiet way he loved most people, did not let it stand. He mounted a counter-operation along with Kakashi, Sakura, and the rest of his old team. In the resulting two-part battle, Kakashi destroyed Kakuzu's first heart with his lightning blade. Hidan accidentally destroyed another with one of his own scythe attacks during the chaos. Naruto destroyed the remaining hearts with a new technique called the Wind-style Rasen Shuriken, and Kakashi finished Kakuzu off with a final Chidori. Hidan, by then separated from the rest of the fight, was outwitted by Shikamaru in a careful trap. Shikamaru detonated explosive tags in a deep forest pit and buried Hidan beneath countless tons of earth. Hidan could not die. He could not get out either. He remained there, alive but immobilized. In the deepest sense of the word, stuck. The world above forgot about him. The Akatsuki had lost 2 more members in a single afternoon. Kisame, around the same period, captured the Four Tails on his own, in a fight that happened off the page of the story, but that the canon confirms happened cleanly. The organization adjusted its plans to account for the loss of the immortal pair. The remaining ceilings could still be completed, but only narrowly. The next major loss was Itachi. His patient long countdown finally ran out. Sasuke Uchiha, who had defected from Konoha years earlier and trained under Orochimaru for the very purpose of one day killing his older brother, finally located him at an old Uchiha hideout. The two of them fought. The fight was the most personal in the entire hunt. Itachi, dying anyway from the long illness in his lungs and from the medicine he had been quietly taking to extend his time, allowed Sasuke to win in the way he had always intended. He pressed his fingers to his brother's forehead one last time in the small, affectionate gesture he had used since they were small children, and he died. The truth of what he had done for Konoha, of why he had killed the clan, of who had ordered the operation, would not be revealed to Sasuke until later, through the masked man's quiet manipulation. Sasuke did not learn it from Itachi himself. Deidara died not long after, in a separate fight against Sasuke. He had spent his entire Akatsuki career obsessing over the Sharingan that had once humiliated him. He had developed a special clay called C4, specifically to bypass it. He had also developed, for the absolute final option, a self-destruction technique in which his entire body became a single enormous explosive. Sasuke, with his own Sharingan and a summon called Manda, narrowly survived the detonation. Deidara did not. The organization had lost 5 members in a single, difficult stretch. Pain, in the meantime, had been waiting for his own moment. He had remained mostly in the Rain Country across all of these missions, allowing his subordinates to handle the fieldwork while he governed Amegakure and prepared. The death of Itachi finally moved the situation in the direction he had been waiting for. The Akatsuki still needed the Nine Tails, the most important of the captured beasts, and the Nine Tails was sealed inside Naruto Uzumaki, who lived inside Konohagakure. Pain decided that the time had come to take him directly. He came to Konoha personally. He brought Konan with him as support. He arrived through 6 bodies at once, the full 6 paths, each carrying its own version of the Rinnegan. The assault that followed was unlike anything the village had seen since the night the Nine Tails itself had attacked decades earlier. Pain entered the village and announced himself by destroying it. He used the almighty push of the Diva Path, a single technique that produced a wide, expanding wave of repulsive force to flatten the entire surface of Konoha into a wide crater. Buildings collapsed, streets disappeared. Thousands of villagers were caught in the wave. Many died. The Hokage at the time, Tsunade, faced him in person and was injured almost to the point of death herself. Jiraiya, who had been Pain's teacher all those years ago, had already fallen to him in an earlier battle in the Rain Country, and so the Toad Sage was not present to defend his old students. The village was, on that single day, brought lower than it had ever been. Naruto returned in time for the second half of the assault. He had been training elsewhere on a technique called Sage Mode, which gave him access to the natural energy of the world around him and dramatically increased his combat ability. He fought Pain across the ruins of his own village. He defeated the 6 paths one at a time. He confronted, finally, the original Nagato in the hidden tower above Amegakure. He did not, in that final confrontation, fight him with techniques. He spoke to him. He asked Nagato about the path that had led him here, about the death of Yahiko. about the dream that had once been a peace movement and had become an organization willing to flatten entire villages. Nagato, who had been waiting for someone to ask him those questions for most of his life, answered them honestly. Naruto told him that the cycle of hatred could be broken. He told him that he, personally, would carry that work forward, and that he believed peace was still possible without trapping the world in any kind of dream. Nagato listened. The dream Yahiko had once died for began to live again, briefly, inside him. He decided, in that small window of clarity, to give Naruto a final gift. He used the Rinnegan technique called the Outer Path, a form of resurrection that returned life to anyone who had recently died, and he applied it across the entire village of Konoha. Every villager Pain had killed in his assault came back to life. The cost of the technique was Nagato's own body. He died in his chair, drained of everything he had left, with Konan at his side. The Akatsuki had lost its public leader. Konan, who had been at his side from the beginning, took his body and Yahiko's body to a place she chose privately, and she buried them together. She defected from the organization in everything but name. She returned to Amagakure and prepared in her own quiet way to defend the Rain Country from whoever came next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Akatsuki has now been broken open from the outside in a way the organization never quite recovered from. Sasori has fallen in the arms of his grandmother. Hidan and Kakuzu have been buried and burned out of action. Itachi has died in his brother's arms in the way he had planned for years. Deidara has burned away in a self-destruction aimed at a Sharingan he could never quite forgive. And Pain himself, the public face of the organization, has been talked back to the dream he had originally inherited and has died returning life to the village he had nearly destroyed. Konan has been left alone in the Rain Country with 2 graves and a promise. In the next and final section, the masked man steps fully into the foreground at last. The real Madara returns through a technique no one expected. The long-planned 4th Great Shinobi War finally begins, and the Akatsuki, after all of its long, careful design, finally runs out of road. Section 10. The 4th Great Shinobi War and the End of the Akatsuki. The death of Pain left the Akatsuki without its visible leader for the first time since the organization had taken its second shape. The world above ground did not yet understand what had happened in the Rain Country Tower. They knew only that Konoha had been attacked, that Naruto Uzumaki had defended his village against an enemy with the Rinnegan, and that the enemy had been turned back. The wider villages, exhausted and shaken, allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. The Akatsuki, in their public estimation, had been damaged in a way it might not recover from. 5 members had been lost in a stretch of months. The leader himself was dead. The hunt for the tailed beasts seemed to have stalled. Behind the scenes, the masked man saw the situation differently. The Akatsuki had been a useful instrument up to this point. It was no longer essential. The plan had reached the stage at which the masked man was prepared to step into the foreground himself, drop the simple Toby alias entirely, and finish the larger work using whatever resources remained. He still had the demonic statue. He still had most of the captured tailed beasts inside it. He still had the underground army of white Zetsu clones that the original Madara had cultivated and that he had been quietly expanding for years. He had almost everything he needed to complete the Eye of the Moon plan. He needed, in the most literal sense, only 2 more things. He needed the 8 tails. He needed the 9 tails. With those 2 beasts added to the 7 already inside the statue, the 10 tails could be reformed, and the rest of the plan could finally unfold. His first move was to consolidate the assets the dead leadership had left behind. Nagato's Rinnegan was the most valuable single object in the world to him at this moment, since the Eye of the Moon plan required Rinnegan eyes to cast the infinite Tsukuyomi against the moon. The eyes were sitting in a freshly buried body somewhere in the Rain Country. Konan, who had defected from the organization in everything but the official notice, was guarding that grave. The masked man went to the Rain Country himself. The encounter that followed was one of the most carefully prepared confrontations in the entire larger story, and it did not go the way the masked man expected. Konan had spent years thinking about him. She had quietly gathered intelligence. She had studied, from observation and inference, the strange Sharingan technique that allowed him to phase his body in and out of physical reality. She had built a trap specifically designed for him. She lured him into a wide, flat clearing. She covered the entire area in roughly 600 billion explosive paper tags, each one rigged to detonate in sequence with the others. She let him commit to the engagement. Then, she set the trap off. The detonation was enormous. It would have killed almost anyone in the world. It came very close to killing the masked man. He survived only by exploiting the tiny intervals during which his phasing technique still worked between the explosions, narrowly slipping in and out of the physical plane until the storm had passed. By the time the smoke cleared, he was wounded. He was not finished. He killed Conan in the aftermath. The fight, on her side, had been the work of years. On his side, it ended with a single hand and a Sharingan. He took her body. He went to the place where Nagato was buried. He removed the Rinnegan from the corpse and took it with him. The original founders of the Akatsuki, the three orphans of the Rain Country, were now all gone. Yahiko in the trap, Nagato in the chair, Conan on the field of paper. The country that had produced them was left, again, without anyone to defend it. The Masked Man, with the Rinnegan secured and the Akatsuki effectively dissolved as a hunting unit, prepared the next phase of the plan. He still needed manpower for the war he intended to start. He no longer had S-rank criminals working under him in any organized roster. He turned instead to a new ally, a young man named Kabuto Yakushi, a former subordinate of Orochimaru and Sasori, and a formidable medic in his own right, approached the Masked Man with an offer. Kabuto had spent the years since Orochimaru's death absorbing aspects of his old master's body into his own, modifying himself with snake biology, and developing an unprecedented mastery of a forbidden technique called the Impure World Reincarnation. The technique allowed its user to bring back the dead in fully bodied form by binding the soul of a deceased shinobi to a living human sacrifice. The revived shinobi retained all of their abilities, gained near total immortality during the duration of the technique, and could only be stopped by being sealed away. Kabuto offered to bring back, on the Masked Man's behalf, an army of legendary dead shinobi to fight in the war he was planning. He named, as proof of his ability, a list of names so large that the Masked Man at first did not believe him. The Masked Man hesitated. He preferred to operate on his own. Kabuto, sensing the hesitation, played his strongest card. He brought back the real Madara Uchiha. The original Madara, the man whose name the Masked Man had been wearing for decades, was alive again, in the same long, white-haired body he had carried at the end of his original life, with all of his powers intact. The Masked Man could no longer pretend to be the figure he had been pretending to be, since the real one was now standing in the same room. He had to agree to the alliance. He did. The war he had been preparing for finally began. He named it openly, in front of the assembled 5 Kage at a summit in the Land of Iron, by declaring the Eye of the Moon plan to the world for the first time. The 5 Kage, after a tense internal debate, refused his demands. They formed an alliance instead. Every shinobi village in the world, for the first time in recorded history, agreed to merge its forces into a single combined military structure. The structure was called the Allied Shinobi Forces. It included shinobi from Konoha, Kumo, Iwa, Suna, Kiri, the smaller villages, and even members from groups that had previously opposed each other. The Hokage, the Raikage, the Tsuchikage, the Kazekage, and the Mizukage all stood under one command. The Fourth Great Shinobi War had begun. The 2 days of fighting that followed were the largest combat operation the world had ever seen. The Masked Man, fighting from behind his mask and still calling himself Madara to his own forces, deployed the White Zetsu army by the tens of thousands. Kabuto deployed the Impure World Reincarnation Army, which included almost every former Akatsuki member. Sasori was raised again. Deidara was raised again. Itachi was raised again. Kakuzu was raised again. Even Nagato was raised again, in the same withered body he had died in, with all 6 paths reconfigured into a single new structure. The Akatsuki, in death, fought one more time on a single battlefield against the village it had been built to either save or destroy, depending on who one asked. The reincarnated members did not all fight on the same side, however. Itachi, in particular, used a small sealed crow he had implanted in Naruto's friend Shisui's old eye years earlier to break free of Kabuto's control. Once free, he hunted Kabuto down personally and forced him to release the entire reincarnation technique. Most of the dead returned to their graves. Nagato, for the brief stretch he had been raised, fought and was sealed away. Itachi, before he himself returned to the dead, walked one last time with Sasuke and gave him the truth that he had been carrying for years. The conversation was quiet. He told Sasuke the real history of the massacre, the orders he had been given, the reason he had spared him. He told him that he loved him, no matter what path he chose. He told him not to live for revenge any longer. Then he disappeared again into the rest he had been denied. Kisame, separately, had been sent on a mission to gather intelligence on the Eight Tails before the war fully began. He had been captured. He committed suicide rather than be interrogated, in a final small loyalty to a vision of a world without lies that he had carried since the day he had killed his own comrades. He died with Samehada absorbed into his own body, surrounded by his sharks, in a way that no one in the Alliance forces watching the moment ever quite forgot. The masked man, in the meantime, removed the curse seal that had been placed on him by the original Madara during their long years in the underground chamber, and finally began to operate without that older man's lingering control. He sealed all 9 of the tailed beasts into himself, becoming the new Jinchuriki of a partially reformed 10 Tails. He prepared to cast the infinite Tsukuyomi. The combined attack of Naruto, Kakashi, and Might Guy, with help from the rest of the Alliance, finally pulled him out of the technique before he could complete it. Black Zetsu, whose deeper plan had been waiting through every step of all of this, intervened at the last possible moment. Black Zetsu forced the masked man to use his Rinnegan to revive the real Madara, who had been killed earlier in the fighting, and to give the resurrected Madara everything he needed to complete the technique on his own behalf. The real Madara, alive properly for the first time in nearly a century, sealed all 9 of the tailed beasts into himself, awakened a third eye on his forehead called the Rinne Sharingan, and cast the infinite Tsukuyomi on the moon. The Genjutsu reflected down across the entire planet. Every living person caught in the moonlight fell into the dream. Roots from a great tree grown out of the demonic statue rose up around each of them and held them in place. The world above ground became silent. The plan, in the visible sense, had succeeded. Then, in the quietest moment, Black Zetsu pierced Madara through the heart from behind. The real Madara had been a tool the entire time. Madara, dying for the second and final time, finally understood. Black Zetsu absorbed the chakra of all 9 tailed beasts through Madara's body, and used it to revive his original mother, Kaguya Otsutsuki, the ancient figure who had been the true target of the entire long plan. Kaguya rose into the world for the first time in many centuries. The fight that followed was no longer a fight against the Akatsuki in any meaningful sense. The Akatsuki, as an organization, had ended in this moment. Its members were either dead, sealed away, or returned to the rest from which Kabuto had pulled them. The masked man, mortally wounded, used the last of his strength to help Naruto and Kakashi against Kaguya in small, final ways. He sent them through a portal with Sakura. He confessed, on his way out, to the small, original boy he had once been beneath the mask, the one who had loved his teammates and had wanted to grow up to be Hokage. He died with Kakashi at his side. The masked man, who had carried the larger plan for decades, returned to being Obito Uchiha at the end, and Obito Uchiha died in peace. Naruto and Sasuke, with help from Kakashi, Sakura, and the spirit of the Sage of the Six Paths himself, sealed Kaguya away in the same prison from which the sage had originally sealed her. Black Zetsu was sealed with her. The demonic statue was finished. The tailed beasts were freed back into the world. Naruto and Sasuke, in their own final fight that followed, came to an understanding. The infinite Tsukuyomi was lifted. The world above ground woke up. The Akatsuki, in the simplest possible sense, was over. The cloaks with the red clouds were not worn by anyone any longer. The hidden tower in the rain country stood empty. The underground chamber where Madara had once recovered Obito had collapsed. The bodies of the original founders rested where Konan had buried them. The bodies of the recruited members rested in graves scattered across the 5 great nations. The masked man had returned to his own name in his last hours and had died as a person rather than as an instrument. Kabuto, who had started the war by reviving the dead, had been sealed by Itachi and later released into a long, quiet life as the caretaker of an orphanage where children with no families could grow up without becoming what he had become. The world the Akatsuki had wanted to either save or replace, depending on which member one asked, was still standing. A small flagging is worth placing here at the end, in the order the canon itself acknowledged. The original idea of the Akatsuki, as it was eventually revealed, did not begin in the Rain Country at all. It began with Black Zetsu, generations earlier, as a small piece of preparation for the larger plan. The name was carried into Madara's mind through the altered tablet. It was carried from Madara to Obito. It may have been planted, in some indirect way, in the air of the Rain Country for Yahiko to find. The peace movement that had begun in a small hideout of orphans was, at its deepest root, a much older and much darker idea wearing a hopeful face. Yahiko's dream had been honest. Konan's dream had been honest. Nagato's dream, until the very moment of his death, had been honest. The shape they had built around those dreams had been a shape someone else had drawn for them centuries earlier. The tragedy of the Akatsuki in the end was not that its members were evil. It was that almost every one of them, in their own private way, had wanted something close to peace, and that the path they had been steered toward had been a path designed to consume them. What remained, after all of it, was the small thing Naruto had said to Nagato in the hidden tower above Amagakure. The cycle of hatred could be broken. It would not be broken by force. It would not be broken by genjutsu. It would not be broken by the surrender of consciousness itself into a beautiful, eternal dream. It would be broken, slowly and imperfectly, by people willing to do the small, daily work of choosing not to pass their own pain on to anyone else. The Rain Country, in the years after the war, found its way back toward a more ordinary kind of peace. Conan was honored as one of its protectors. The graves of the 3 orphans were maintained. Children grew up in the wet streets without having to bury their dogs in alleys. The dawn the original Akatsuki had been named for, in the smallest sense, finally arrived. And it arrived without anyone having to die for it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.